Hello, and welcome to the Canadian Story, where we discuss what Canada is, what Canada could be, and what Canada should be. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Canadian Story. I'm quite excited about this episode because we're going to be interviewing perhaps one of the most controversial figures in Ontario politics right now, Roman Baber. So, Roman, why don't you give us a 30-second bio, and then we'll go right into it.
Thank you, David. Good to be with you. Good to be with your listeners. My name is Roman Baber. I'm an MPP from York Centre, which is the west side of North York. And as some of your listeners know, I've been removed by the Premier from the Ontario Progressive Conservative Caucus about a month ago for writing a letter, open letter to the Premier in which I opposed the lockdowns. I'm an immigrant to Canada. I was born in the Soviet Union. When I was 9, we moved to Israel. And when I was 15, we moved to Canada, directly to Sheppard and Bathurst, an area I now represent. And I've been very, very blessed to be Exhibit A for Canadian Opportunity. I went to William Mackenzie in York University for poli-sci. I then went to Western for law school and was blessed with a wonderful legal career, practiced commercial and civil litigation for 12 years. And then elected first to Provincial Parliament in 2018, and had a remarkable run thus far.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely served some interesting roles. I think the last time you and I were on opposite sides of things was I believe you supported McKay and I supported Aaron O'Toole, but we could talk about that on another episode perhaps. I think what the listeners are really interested in and what myself and Zach are really interested in is you took a very principled stand that has cost you potentially your political career. I don't actually believe it's cost you your political career, but there are a lot of people who do. So can you walk us through why you made this decision, what it means for you, what it means for the people of Ontario, and actually what it means for the people of Canada?
Sure. I made the decision to speak out after speaking with hundreds of constituents and people across Ontario who told me, look, the lockdown is causing more harm than good. And I believe that the data supports that as well. So I wrote about the impacts of the lockdown on health, on mental health, on the increase in overdoses, suicidal thoughts, and the economic toll on Ontarians. And all of those things I submit should be factored into our decision-making. So it's important to have a fair and open discussion, not only about the risk of the virus, but also the catastrophic effect of the lockdown.
Yeah, I mean, I know Zach and I are in 100% agreement with you on this, and I've spoken to a number of people on this. I think the real problem here is that we have leaders in this country who are timid men. They're not willing to make hard decisions and they don't want any blood on their hands, which, I mean, who wants blood on their hands? But the end result is that they have a lot more blood on their hands. I mean, I'm from Alberta, kind of the epicenter of the opioid crisis right now. And opioid deaths have skyrocketed during lockdown because we're social animals. We need one another. And when we're isolated, I mean, there's a reason that isolation is used as torture.
Yes, David, exactly right. So in politics, just like in medicine, it's important that we weigh the consequences of our actions. And objectively, what we're seeing is that the lockdown is causing a catastrophic unintended consequence, not only on people, but on our healthcare system as well. Cancer screenings have significantly decreased. I cited in my letter an oncologist from Princess Margaret who spoke out and said, look, he's fearing a tsunami of cancer because cancer screenings are down by about 40%. Cancer didn't disappear. We're just diagnosing it late. I had a physician, Dr. Phillips, write to me 2 weeks ago, say he's never diagnosed so much advanced cancer in his emergency room. Overdoses were trending 50% above normal midway through the year. And in fact, the numbers are staggering. City of Toronto came out on January 29th, and they said that year over year from 2019 to 2020, the difference in overdoses is 67%, about 300 people. That is about the same number as all the people that died in the province of Ontario from or with COVID under the age of 60. And while every death is tragic, and in my faith, we say that one life is tantamount to the entire universe. So we have to protect every single life. But I wrote a letter not about the economy or about jobs per se. I actually stressed the fact that instead of we may be compromising lives by virtue of what we're doing. And I may be wrong, but this weighing exercise, I think, is an important exercise, and we should not bury our heads in the sand. And instead, we should really think and audit and calculate whether what we're doing is actually causing more deaths than otherwise would accrue. God forbid.
Well, and one of the things that my cousin and I say to each other a lot is we aren't stopping cars from driving on the roads, and just because every life matters, right? Society has basically come to the agreement that in order for us to be able to get from place to place, we are going to sacrifice a certain number of human lives in the process of doing that. Now, we can debate the morality of that, but it is consensus. Imagine if we said no more driving because we need to save every life.
Okay, so you're exactly right. And of course, there's calculated risks, and there's risks that we generally as society assume. And then there's also way sensible risk when the risk level is elevated. There's a possibility that in fact, I believe that we had made an error as it pertains to COVID response. We did so because we didn't have enough information in the beginning. This is now a very different virus than we thought that it was in March or April. And don't get me wrong, COVID is very real. And it's very transmissible. It's a type of coronavirus. It has some unique qualities, such as it can sometimes attack various parts of the body, be it cardio or the brain or even lungs or kidney. But generally speaking, it is, and it has an interesting exception for folks with diabetes for some reason. But generally speaking, we know that it attacks, or that it's dangerous for very vulnerable, and by that I mean the very vulnerable populations. And that includes folks that live in congregate settings, and generally people over 80. More than 80% of all Ontarians who passed away from COVID or with COVID were over the age of 80. And more than 80% of them were living in congregate homes, where the life expectancy is typically about 14 months. And so on average, regretfully, these folks were in their last year of life. And I'm not saying that we don't need to think about them. In fact, we have failed them. The provincial government, a year later almost, we still don't have proper infection protocol and control in place. We're still short-staffed, and the premier is refusing to call in the military, even though he says he wants assistance from everybody because he doesn't want another report. And we still have agency workers. We still have agency walking back and forth from one home to another, potentially spreading COVID. So we need to focus on helping and safeguarding those that are at risk from COVID, instead of imprisoning 15 million Ontarians and making healthy people sick.
And not only that, taking away our freedom in such a way. I don't know how much you paid attention to that barbecue restaurant and what they did to that guy in Toronto, but if you did, I'd love your thoughts on it.
Look, obviously the case of Adamson Barbecue was sensationalized somewhat, but the principle stands is that if public service, and these are elected officials, these are public office holders, they're appointed, they serve at the pleasure of elected officials that are responsible to the people, and there's no reason why we don't need to hold them responsible or question their decisions. And so,
I know the fact that we're not even being allowed to question the quote unquote decisions of experts. And I really do believe this is actually a failure of decision making. It's an unwillingness to make decisions that's got us to this point. But the fact that we're being told we're not even allowed to question this, and that if we do, we're going to be kicked out of our party, or we're going to be blackballed, or we're not going to be allowed to travel. This is not the freedom of the West that our ancestors, at least my ancestors, fought and died for.
David, exactly right. As I mentioned to you, I was born in the Soviet Union. We're questioning authority, we're questioning the regime, could publicly, or even with your neighbors or friends, could land someone in a labor camp. Of course, we don't have anything of that sort here, but there seems to be a prevailing culture of fear and generally foreclosure on debate. And that seems completely irresponsible to me, given the extraordinary times we're going through. It's only typically decision-making process is enhanced where you hear different perspectives, and when you put decision makers to the test to defend what it is that they suggest.
Well, and how can they, like, this is what's
Sure.
driving me nuts. This is what's driving me nuts. And you're an elected official. I've never been an elected official, but I've worked for dozens of them, including Prime Minister Harper, Premier Kenny. And one of the things I've always admired in what I would quote unquote call great leaders is that they take responsibility for their decisions. I'm not seeing a lot of responsibility taking happening across this country right now for the pain and torment and life shattering decisions that they're making for people, because they don't think those people matter somehow. I mean, all of the people who are keeping this going are not being impacted by it. The media, they've never had it so good. The politicians, they're not losing their jobs. The healthcare workers, well, we have socialized medicine, so no matter what happens economically, they're going to still have their jobs. The teachers, right? Well, of course they don't want disease spreading in their schools, but they're not going to lose their jobs if there's a lockdown. But what about the millions of Canadians who are on the edge of financial ruin to save our 80-year-olds?
So just to round out, David, good question. Just to finish the point on questioning government, not only we should be able to question government and public officials not only during extraordinary times, especially during extraordinary times, but at all times.
Yes.
Questioning government is a fundamental premise of democracy. It's why my family is here. It's why I think all of us are here. And when you go down that road where somehow that is frowned upon or is punishable, you discourage dissent, and then you're into potentially horrible consequences.
Well, I also think that the discouragement of dissent is a form of cowardice, right? And it's an unwillingness to defend your own position with rhetoric and debate, and instead you're basically, when people do what they've done to you, they're admitting that you're probably right, but they don't care because they want to keep control.
Yeah, that's a very important. That's a good point that you raised, David. The government never actually addressed any of the issues that are raised in my letter, right? They made all sorts of accusations against me. They picked on to a typo. I challenged them on their allegation of misinformation. I think I was correct. I stand by my reference letter, but never did they actually address the fundamental point, which is, should we not weigh the cost, the toll, the adverse effect of our response against COVID? And surely we have to do that, because in politics, just like in medicine, we have to weigh the cost of our actions. And objectively, the lockdown is taking a catastrophic toll on people, on the economy, but most importantly, on the healthcare of Ontarians, be it by way of their health or mental health. And so weighing that against COVID at large is a legitimate and necessary inquiry.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for anyone but myself in a lot of ways, but I would say from a mental health perspective, this last year has been one of the most difficult of my life, right? I'm a social animal. I love being around people. I need human interaction to, that's what fuels my enjoyment of life, and I'm being trapped in my own home. Like, and people say, well, David, like, why don't you care? Don't you want to help? Yeah. I mean, if I was actually saving a lot of lives by staying in my house, I would, but I don't believe that's what's happening. Something else is happening. I don't know what it is, but we're not saving that many lives right now. And we're certainly not, I really do believe the cost of this is much, much higher than the benefit.
You are not saving any lives because there's absolutely no proportional relationship between cases and metrics that truly matter, like ICUs and mortality. Since the beginning of the stay-at-home order, we had about 130,000 cases, about a third of all cases since the beginning of the pandemic. But the ICU number is actually going down.
Yeah.
Reality is largely unchanged, because it's not about how much COVID, it's not about cases or how many people get COVID. It's about who gets COVID. David, if you and I get COVID, we're statistically, we're going to be okay.
I have friends who got it and they didn't even know they had it.
but we don't need to dismiss it. I'm not saying that we should dismiss it. I'm making a different point, because it can be a very serious virus and it can be very deadly to certain folks. But you can have 100,000 kids infected with COVID today, and hospitalization is not going to move a nudge, versus 200 seniors getting COVID today in long-term care home, and God forbid 100 of them are going to pass.
Yes.
And so what you need, and so we finally need to come to the sensible realization that there's absolutely no relationship between cases and the metrics that matter. What we need to do is we need focused protection on vulnerable population. 10 months later, the government has yet to work out infection protocol and control. 10 months later, we're short-staffed considerably in long-term care homes. 10 months later, we still haven't banned temporary workers and agency workers from going from one home to another. And instead, we're just we're not safeguarding healthy people from harm. We're imprisoning and we're making healthy people sick.
Yeah. And I want to add to that, because I think what you just said is incredibly important. And the listeners need to understand we're being fed a bunch of bullshit, right? And that bullshit is, oh, look at all the cases. We have to keep the cases down. The cases aren't the problem. It's vulnerable people. And what I don't understand is we have a federal government sending out $2,000 checks to everybody, and letting and the provinces all lined up, keeping people at home, when those people don't want a $2,000 check. They want to be able to work.
Conservatives used to say that the best government program is a job. And of course, for those that are able-bodied and are not compromised by disability, that is always true. And any business owner or any employee you speak to would tell you they don't want government support. They want to go back to work. And I want to talk about the effect on the economy for a minute, because somehow folks believe that it's just there's small shops and the restaurants. That's not the case at all. I practiced bankruptcy and commercial litigation early in my career, and I can tell you that the economy has a very serious domino effect. When a small business fails, the failure is not limited to that business. It affects their employees. It affects their suppliers, their trade creditors, their landlords, their lenders, and all of their families. And so we now have 500,000 people in Ontario that are still unemployed in comparison to pre-pandemic levels. We have tens of thousands, if not already in the 100,000 mark, businesses shut down, never returning. And what about those folks and their health? Because we know that there's a direct connection between economic well-being and health well-being. And how about their families? There's no thinking. There's absolutely no thought being given to them. It's tragic.
Why do you think so? Like, you've been in the room, decision maker, I've been in the room helping decision makers. What do you think went wrong?
Okay, David. So I think it's what went wrong in many other places around the world, especially those that don't have courage to admit a mistake.
Right.
I do not believe in any great resets or any world forum stuff. I think all of this is a lot simpler. You have a very sensational story. You have a new virus that haven't been seen before. It's coming from China. People are not sure how it came about. Then very early on, you see some deaths, but we don't test enough for COVID, so we don't understand how prevalent it is, which leads us to believe that the fatality rate from COVID is very, very high. So we now start believing that it's a very deadly disease. We take a lesson from China, and for the first time in our pandemic management history, we do a broad lockdown, something we've never done before. And on with it we go. And sometime towards the middle of May, we start understanding, well, maybe this is not as dangerous as we thought. And I say that for two reasons. Number one, we understand where the focus is. It's with vulnerable populations that need protection and not with the population at large. And number two, we learn that the infection rate is so high that the metrics that we're worried about are actually significantly better than we thought. Let me explain this point. For me, COVID was over around the end of May, maybe earlier, when Stanford University came out and said that the infection rate is 50 times cases. That means that for every person that they were diagnosing with COVID, there was another 50 walking with COVID. That was a very good thing, because that meant that the mortality rate, the hospitalization rate, is 50 times lower, right? Other jurisdictions place this serological data around the 20-time cases. But that narrative we have never been able to share good news about COVID. We ruled out we ruled out surfaces fairly quickly. That has not been discussed. We had very little discussion about asymptomatic transmission when a healthy person passes a virus to another healthy person. We have not discussed that, even though everything merits a discussion. Everything merits a fair discussion. And so what ended up happening, if I may, and I'm sorry for the long-winded answer.
No worries. I'm loving this. Keep going.
You had a virus that we've never seen before and not clear how it came about. You have a very high mortality rate, and you have a mistake. And a lot of folks are unwilling to admit that mistake, which is the lockdown. And so there are a lot of careers and reputations that are at play. But beyond that, when we thought that the world was ending in March and April, a politically correct narrative formed that, we have to watch out for everyone and we have to be safe. And in fairness, I was part of that narrative.
Yeah, stay home, save lives, right?
For sure. But then that narrative became a politically correct narrative. And these days, politically correct narratives are fortified by cancel culture.
Yes.
So if you dare to speak out against this prevalent politically correct narrative, you ought to be canceled. And so that prevents professionals, experts, academics, doctors, nurses, healthcare professionals, educators from speaking out and saying what we're doing is absolutely nonsensical, because they'll be canceled just like I was canceled by the government. So we are continuing this exercise in insanity. We're causing an untold harm to people at large, especially to children. And for some reason, there's unwillingness whatsoever to exercise leadership and say, you know what, we're going to be honest about what's transpiring here and do what's best for folks.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. And this is why I often say on this podcast, we must save this country from timid men, because really this is a problem of courage, a lack of leadership. It's an unwillingness to take responsibility for a mistake.
Yes. The folks running the operation on the health side, the command table, which has ballooned apparently to 500 people.
Can you imagine trying to make a decision with 500 people in a room?
What ends up happening is you have two people making decisions, and they tell the 500, and 500 are afraid of actually saying what's going on. But this is odd, because Doug Ford campaigned on efficiencies, and you would not think that a conservative would have 500 people. And instead, what you have is this crazy medical narrative where they refuse to acknowledge error. And I like to challenge the modeling table all the time, and I've done so repeatedly and successfully, may I add, in that I say, look, you have actually hit the metrics, the case metrics that you were worried about, whether it was during the fall preparedness or during the stay-at-home order. The trajectory or the number of cases the modeling folks are worried about did materialize. But the ensuing consequences, such as the ICU number, the deaths, did not. And they tend to over-exaggerate, they tend to overestimate all the time. And it's on the basis of that we make remarkable decisions that affect people's lives in a very profound way, and especially the management of hospitals, in that we are rationing our healthcare capacity. We are closing beds, we're closing wards, we're taking labor off the table in order to preserve for a COVID response. And in doing so, preserving for a response that doesn't materialize, we actually end up compromising the healthcare of Ontarians.
And Canadians. This is the Canadian story after all.
Absolutely. Look, I can speak to the province of Ontario.
Yes, no. I want to make it clear to the listeners, we're not just talking about Ontario here. I think this problem is just as bad in Alberta right now, maybe even worse, because Albertans are more private sector in their employment, which means it's hurting us disproportionately more than it is Ontarians even.
The tragedy is coast to coast, and I don't know. I'm perplexed, David, by what I'm seeing from the federal government and the unwillingness of Canadians, and especially the conservative infrastructure, to say a word about what's transpiring. I cannot understand how is it that a Canadian could be detained.
Oh, I know.
Simply for entering Canada. It's astonishing to me. And we have not heard from one opposition MP on this issue. And it's
because they're all afraid. They're terrified. What's happened is we live in, I don't know, I'd love your opinion on this, but this is my analysis of the situation. Fear has become the dominant emotion in the lives of Western people. And I'm not talking about race, religion, creed. I'm just saying, for some reason in the West, and by the West, I mean kind of the democratic world, fear has become the predominant emotion.
Yes.
Why?
I think that, first of all, the virus itself, as I said just earlier, when we weren't doing testing and we found people COVID positive dying from COVID, we thought that the fatality rate is very high. Second of all, we had a very different approach to this pandemic and information flow and awareness by virtue of media and social media. And there's no question that the amount of fear that has went into this is so profound that I'm not even sure at which point, it doesn't matter what graph I produce or what table I show, even using the Ministry of Health's own numbers. Getting through this fear will be very, very difficult.
And I have this theory. Ben Shapiro and I do not agree. Ben Shapiro's like, facts don't care about your feelings, and I often say feelings don't care about facts. And what we're in right now is a time where facts are not going to be the way we get out of this. We need people to become more courageous and start standing up. I would argue, like you did. I don't know you very well. We've never really worked together, but when you took that stand, I and many, many people like me were like, that is the moral position.
So you're correct. I'm perplexed why the government is also active in this process, in that it's refusing to divulge good news, in that it's refusing to delineate a line between deaths in congregate settings and deaths in the community. And most importantly, I'm seeing instances. There was a doctor that came to my defense a couple of days after the letter, former Chief Medical Officer of Health for the province of Ontario, who served for 10 years. Dr. Shabas wrote a letter in my support, said Roman Baber was right on all 5 points. And then towards the end, he said, the province is fear-mongering. It's using a death metric, a mortality metric that is not accurate. It's using the case fatality rate instead of infection rate. Now, this is a little technical, but it's important to understand. The province is basing its mortality estimates on the basis of known cases, as opposed to the correct metric, which is the estimated infections. And what that does is optically, it significantly increases the number, the mortality expectation. And it does so in absence. It's so arbitrary because it's all subject to whim of testing. And Dr. Shabas said that the province is doing that in order to fearmonger people into submission to public health rules, and specifically the lockdown. And I find that astonishing.
Well, I have a theory on this that I wanted to run by you. But let's look at Manitoba, Saskatchewan, BC, New Brunswick. What happened when their incumbent governments called an election? They won sweeping majorities, every single one. And you know why? Because Napoleon said there's two things to hold a man's attention: interest or fear. Those are the only two ways. So if you have to be either interesting or you have to make them afraid. Well, if the government can make people afraid, what are they going to do? Say, protect me, government.
Sure. Look, this is another interesting maybe spin-off, a political spin-off of the story, is that we have seen governments benefit generally from pandemic and pandemic response by way of electoral fortunes. I believe that much of what is happening right now is political. I think that the premier is at a point where he doesn't see how he can come before the voters and say, well, I'm not going to listen to public health anymore. He thinks that he's going to wear the consequences of that decision. But the second thing is, politicians are very interested in their electoral prospects and re-election. And the provincial government, at least in their mind, is polling very, very high. They think, Doug Ford thinks that he's going to win a supermajority, and he probably thinks that there's no reason to do anything different. And that is very, very unfortunate, because he points to Jason Kenney and says, I don't want to be like Jason Kenney potentially and open up and get in trouble electorally. And what that does, this absence of leadership, putting politics before people, putting politics before policy, unfortunately here may have deadly consequences.
Well, I have a lot of theories around this. I actually think that the Canadian political system is one of the most embarrassing in the entire G8. And in the spirit of the Canadian story, I will tell what I think my solution to that should be, because we're not allowed to criticize without offering a solution. My solution is we need to start treating our politicians better and stop nickel and diming them. We want to be attracting the best and the brightest of our country to help make policy decisions. And you can't pay your best and your brightest 150 to 165 grand a year. Why would they go and do that? The only reason they would do is out of one of two reasons: ego or a desire for public service. And so there are good politicians in this country, but we are not attracting the best and the brightest into politics, because we're not and Singapore figured this out a long time ago. Lots of places have. All you have to do is make the compensation worthy of a minister of health in Ontario. What's the budget for the Ministry of Health? You probably know.
65 billion.
That's a $65 billion company being run, right? You want Elon Musk level intelligence running that for you.
Right. and unfortunately, it's not even the minister that's running it. It's a bureaucrat and their bureaucrats and their layers of bureaucrats that are running this. And they're completely unaccountable. And they have no fear of any consequences for their mismanagement or incompetence. You don't get demoted or you don't get fired. You typically get promoted in order to be alleviated from a position.
Well, I mean, that is the brokenness of the system. I call it the iron law of bureaucracy. Well, I don't call it that. That's what it's called, right? Is a system's put into place, and then the system's purpose is lost, and it becomes simply to perpetuate the system itself. That's the iron law of bureaucracy, right?
I have yet to, David, I've been out of government for about a month, and I have yet to really sit down. I've been very, very busy with the lockdown, because all I'm doing is I'm working on persuading and advocacy to get the government to lift the lockdown. But I have yet to really sit down and contemplate and digest what it is that I've seen in the last 3 years. The astonishing level of waste and mismanagement, the rules and protocol in place to get anything accomplished, the timeframes within which people operate, people's appetite to serve, and the consequences stemming from that. There will be a day, and maybe you'll invite me back and we'll think about that some more. But I can tell you that, to your point, you want to encourage the best and the brightest, but you also want a political system that enables some sort of check and balance. And
yes.
In fairness, the British parliamentary system may not be ideal for check and balance, where the leader of the party is also leader of parliament, is also leader of the government. So that creates an interesting.
Yes, we should have a discussion on that, because I think we're going to be, and what I've been telling people is we're entering what I call the churn. I don't know if you've read the fourth turning or not, but we're in the transition period. This happens all the time. all you have to do is read history to see where we're at. Wealth inequality has massively increased, which means there's going to be civil unrest. Governments are becoming worried, so they're trying to assert more control. This is the oldest story in the human playbook, right? But
Yes.
the change is coming, and it's already happening. And there's just a lot of status quo people who benefit from things remaining exactly as they are and nothing changing, who are fighting back against it, but they're losing.
I think, regretfully, we're suffering a considerable disconnect in what we're typically used to from a political system to what is now happening during the age of COVID. I am very saddened, David, and this is something that I have yet to fully articulate publicly, that first, it almost seemed as if the media was not interested in anything that did not involve the inquiry of, are we doing enough to save us from COVID, as opposed to, does this make sense? Then we encounter a culture on social media where if you speak out against this politically correct narrative, you're going to be killed by virtue of a Twitter mob. Then we had a situation where we had to cohort in Parliament in order to allow for physical distancing. Only half of us were allowed. And then banned outdoor gatherings, so there's no public square.
Yep. So keep the people away from one another. I mean, the Chinese outlawed Clubhouse in China because they couldn't have regular people talking to one another in such a free and open place.
Yeah, and then eventually, I was for government. So we didn't have the media, we didn't have the social media, we didn't have the public square. We didn't fully have Parliament. Parliamentary debate ended on the pandemic response with Bill 195, and then we also didn't have an ability to remain in government while articulating a position against the narrative. So I think we need to really be concerned with some of our principal institutions, and make sure that, God willing, when we come out of this, and we will, I think that we figure out a way to preserve these institutions.
Yeah, one of the things that I've been saying, and to anyone who will listen, is we do not understand how angry the people are becoming, and there's nothing more dangerous than a bunch of angry people who have realized that the game is rigged against them.
I don't think that has happened yet. I don't think that folks really understand that, but I do fear a significant crisis when folks realize that, look, if I lost my business, I lost my life savings, I lost something that was very, very dear to me because of a virus, and I stayed home and saved lives, and everyone did, so that's okay. That's one thing. But when more and more folks are now realizing that the public health narrative has been false, the reaction can be devastating, and my heart goes out, and I do understand the anger, David. I felt in the weeks leading to my letter, I could take it no more. I have heard of so much, as they say in the English language, tsuris. I've heard of so many trouble, so many heartbreaking situations that I couldn't contain my sadness, and I guess I couldn't contain my actions anymore. I felt that I had the obligation to speak out on behalf of people that are compromised either by way of health, mental health, or economically.
Well, and I guess I'll just say this to you. I honor that in you, because this was not a decision that maybe in the long run it will benefit you, because I believe you were right. But in the short term, you made sacrifices of your personal and professional career to stand up for what you believe is right. And now, there are definitely people who think you're wrong and who think I'm wrong. And they're entitled to that opinion too, but we should at least be able to have the debate.
Absolutely. I am entitled to be wrong.
Yes.
But I'm entitled to speak, and I'm entitled to be wrong. So, David, I thank you for being gracious to me.
Absolutely. And just one last question. Sure. We got 3 minutes left here. and I ask everyone on the podcast. So just in a 2-minute summary, why do you love this country?
I came to Canada on September 5th, 1995. I came to Sheppard and Bathurst. I looked outside of the window and I saw Earl Bales Park and Yonge Street and lights and towers on the other side. I recount that story quite often, and I was in love from day one. And David, we didn't have a cent to our name. My first bed in Canada was from a dumpster behind 606 Sheppard. My father sold ice cream on those yellow bicycles. But I've always had a job, and I've always had this incredible joy because it didn't really matter. Because when you come to Canada, the only thing you have opportunity. You don't need anything else. And I truly believe that there's nothing systemic standing in our way. This country, this city, this province gives us every opportunity to learn, to succeed, to grow, to work, and it lets us do that while maintaining our cultural and religious heritage and feeling safe and free. All you need to do to succeed in Canada is work harder and be nice to people, and that's it.
Yes. And here's the problem. That's what these politicians are taking away from us.
I am scared that COVID will compromise that. Absolutely. Which is why I encourage your listeners to remain optimistic, to speak against the lockdown, and continue keeping the government to account. The public health narrative has to make sense. A very smart lawyer taught me early in my career, if it doesn't make sense, it's probably not true. And a lot
I love that.
A lot of this doesn't make sense.
I know you got to go. We'll definitely have you on again. Thank you so much for giving us this time. And thank you for standing up for people who don't have a voice.
I appreciate that sincerely, David. Be well.
Be well as well.
Thank you for listening to The Canadian Story. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at The CAD Story. That's The CAD Story. If you enjoy this podcast, please share it with your friends and family. Let's work together to remind Canadians how great their country is.